No doubt, God expects us to worship. I don't think anybody would necessarily say that that's something I don't have to worship. That's not it. And God does expect that of us, and He expects us to have a Bible. But He's not saying here that the way that you walk as a wise man is to be sure that you bring your Bible to worship service, although you should. The matter here that He's talking about is understanding what is the will of God. Not just having a Bible, not just worshiping God, but putting your all of effort into it so that it guides my life. It guides the decisions I make. It guides the choices I make. It guides my walk. The idea in chapters 4, 5, and 6 is about the walk, the conduct that we are to live in, making the most of the time that we have and focusing our attention on understanding what the will of the Lord is. That's pretty easy. I guess I could end the sermon here if everybody's in agreement with what is going on. It's not complex, in other words. But yet, we like to contrast this with a lot of things in our life. And I want to show the contrast between being wise and walking wise as men, making the most of our time so as to understand the will of God, and maybe what we find ourselves sometimes doing. Look in Luke chapter 12. I'll show you a few of these. Luke chapter 12. Stark contrast this idea to how men sometimes live and what they allow to direct their steps and decisions, their choices, their time and their energy and all those sort of things. I'm confident that most here are familiar with the parable that's in Luke chapter 12. He talks about a rich man, and his land was very productive. You see that in verse 16. But in verse 17, he begins to reason to himself. He starts asking himself, well, what am I going to do? I've had a successful crop. I've had a successful year. And so now I've got to start making some choices. And my life choices is how am I going to spend my time? How am I going to spend my money? And really it boils down to where will I allot my priorities? What am I going to do? But I want you to just notice just one single letter as we read here. And that letter is I. Just focus in on it, if you will, as we read. Look at verse 17. What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build large ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. This man's attitude was purely selfishness. What about me? What about I? What about my things? There's no, let me consult God. Let me go to God in prayer about this. Let me look at His words. No, it's a complete focus on himself. This stands in stark contrast to what we read in Ephesians 5, 15 through 17. Walking as wise men so as to understand the will of God, making the most of our time. Here, this man's saying it's all about me. Now, we have needs, and I understand that. But what we need to do, really, is to understand the will of God and make the most of our time so that we walk as wise men. It's simple. Coy, you don't understand. You're just a preacher. You have no idea what it is. I got things that I got to do. I got things at the house that I need to get together. I've got things that I have to do to my home to make it more comfortable. I've got to take care of how my house is presented to the neighborhood, and I've got to focus on what's going out there. Well, I got this job, and I've got to make sure that I'm saving up enough for retirement. And so I focus on getting a little bit of overtime when I can so that I can lay up a little bit more. Maybe I can retire a few years early if I'll just work a little bit more overtime. What we start doing when we start living this way is we start focusing on me. We start focusing on self. We don't focus on making the most of our time so as to understand the will of God. Instead, we say, I've got to take care of me, and I've got to take care of my needs and my material welfare. And once I get done with that, maybe I'll have a little time to understand the will of God. Maybe I'll have a little time then, but the fact of the matter is, I don't have the energy. I don't have the time. I don't have the pursuit then to walk as a wise man who would walk in the understanding of the will of God. Now, you know what happens to this man, as you read here in Luke chapter 12. He spent his life accumulating things. And in verse 20, God said to him, "You fool, this very night your soul's required of you. And now who will own all that you prepared?" In other words, you die bankrupt. What a lifetime investment to spend all of your time and energy on the kind of things that cannot take one of them with you. Oh, the Pharaohs tried. Go look at their tombs and how they filled it with wealth. Not a single one of them goes with them. Not a one of them will you take to eternity. What a waste. Pursuing the understanding of the will of the Lord, that is what will prepare us for eternity. There's another contrast that we'll see, something that people find themselves doing. This one's going to be found over in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And this may be, I hope it's not us, but it may simply be those that we work with, those that we go to school with, our friends, our neighbors, the people that we interact with daily in our lives. And so we start trying to figure out what to do and how to live and what's right and what's wrong. And we start trying to gather that information. Well, Corinth was a unique city. In the city of Corinth, I think the best way that I know to describe Corinth is wicked. It had everything that you could imagine. There were people there that drank. There were people there that committed fornication. People there that lied, steal, all those sort of things. And you, if you lived in Corinth at this time, could have easily lived like everybody else. But yet he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 33, "Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals." Now, I know the context of what he's talking here of resurrection. I get that idea, but he says, you be careful about who you associate with. We sometimes use the excuse, my friends invited me to go. My friends invited me to be there. My friends wanted to go to the ball game. Now, brethren, I like to go to a ball game as much as the next person does. Nothing necessarily wrong sometimes in that. Here's where the issue is found. Where's our devotion? Where's our attention given? Walk as wise men so as to be like our friends? Or walk as wise men, making the most of our time, seeking to understand the will of the Lord? You may say, well, I get that, and so I'll just focus on my friends here in the church. I just want you to be careful about taking the advice of others in general. You take advice from me all day long, but that doesn't make my advice right. I can take advice from you, and that doesn't always make it right. So here's what we'll do. We'll just be sure that my friends are good company, and that would be an admirable pursuit. But look in 3 John real fast. It's not on the screen, but add it to your notes. 3 John. There's a guy in 3 John that's a member of the church. He's there with you. If you're a member there, this is a guy that has some clout, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, there in the local church. There are good people in the local church, in the congregation, and there are good people that want to help you decide how to live, want to encourage you to do right. But you know what? There could be some people in the local church that can lead you down the wrong path. That may be harsh, not trying to be harsh, but there's a guy here like that. 3 John verse 9 says, "I wrote something to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be first among them, does not accept what we say. For this reason, if I come, I'll call attention to his deeds, which he does, unjustly accusing us with wicked words. Not satisfied with this, he himself does not receive the brethren either. He forbids those who desire to do so and puts them out of the church." Now, if you're a member of the church where Diotrephes is, do you let him dictate how you think? Do you let him dictate how you live, or is it the Apostle John and the others? Do you devote yourself to reading those letters that he says, no, we're not reading that, we're not listening to that? Who do you listen to? It becomes difficult. Look at verse 11. "Beloved, do not imitate what is evil." Now, you could pluck verse 11 out of context and say, now see that evilness that's happening over there across the street and down the road, we don't imitate that. And I'm not saying that that's wrong to not imitate it. I'm just saying this isn't the verse for it. Because contextually in the verse, when he says this at the beginning of verse 11, do not imitate what is evil, he's talking here about this attitude that Diotrephes has. There are people in churches that you do not want to imitate. If we just simply say, I'm going to pick out someone and decide how to live and follow in their steps because they've been a Christian for a long time, that may be a good or bad decision. We should better be careful about who we're allowing to impact us in that way, to influence us. Do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. Verse 12, Demetrius has a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself. And we add our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. So here's your option in the church there. You can follow after Diotrephes, or you can follow after Demetrius. Which one of the two are you going to allow to impact you and influence you? The choice as to who you're going to follow. Well, which is the choice? The choice is Ephesians chapter 5. And walking as wise men, making the most of our time so as to understand what the will of the Lord is. Which of these two men are going to help you in that? Sometimes people just go with, what is the advice of other people? People of the world, people in the church. Here's what we got to get down to. What is it that's going to help me understand what the will of the Lord is so that I can walk as wise men? I bet you turn to your Old Testament for this next one. The book of Isaiah, chapter 47. This one's an interesting one. I don't know that there are a lot of Christians that let this influence them, but there are some. And I want us to be wary of this and be very cautious of this, because sometimes people try to decide how they're going to live based upon their horoscope. They got to read that thing every day, make my decisions based upon astrology or horoscopes or whatever the stars are in controlling my life. People give in to this sort of mentality. And when you look I've done got the wrong one put on my notes here. Hang on. No, go to Deuteronomy. I'll grab my next one. Deuteronomy chapter 18. It's going to get where I need to be. Deuteronomy chapter 18. I'll come back to Isaiah tonight. You got to be here tonight to know which one I meant to write down right there. Deuteronomy chapter 18. There are all those people that look at the stars, look at the astrology and try to figure out what we're going to do, read that sort of thing, pull it up on the internet every day. But the children of Israel here in Deuteronomy chapter 18 had come out of Egyptian bondage, and Moses was their leader, and he preaches this sermon to them. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, it's a classic passage in verse 9. He says, when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, you shall not learn to imitate the detestable things of those nations. So he says, don't imitate what those are doing around you. And he lists 9 things here in this text. You notice the verse 11. One who casts a spell, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. So you've got all these kind of unique things that are going on around them that all these people were participating in. Back up in verse 10, he says, there shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire. All those sort of witchcraft and sorceries and divination. I thought, do I put this one in the lesson this morning or not? And so this is what I decided to do. I decided to just Google palm readers in Abilene, Texas. And you think, I've never been to a palm reader. There must not be any here. Oh, no, there's plenty. Up and down this road. Up and down other roads. They have enough to stay in business, I guess. I don't know. Anybody read tarot cards? Try to figure out what you're going to do? Sometimes we think about those sort of things and we think, oh, that's just foolishness. But some people will, in contrast to figure out how to live, say, that's what I'm going to listen to. Some sort of sorcery or omens or some sort of how the stars are happening or some mysterious happening. In this case, notice what the prophet says in verse 18. It says, I will raise up a prophet from among their countrymen, like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. It shall come about that whoever will not listen to my words, which he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. So he says, I'm going to raise up a prophet. But they got a prophet right there in front of them in Moses. And so what he's saying is there's going to come a time when there's going to be a prophet like him. That is Jesus Christ. How are we to walk as wise men? Do all the other sort of things, the mediums and spiritists and all that he talks about before, or listening to the prophet, listening to Jesus the Christ? What is it that we're going to listen to? All right, let's look at the next one. This one back in the New Testament, John chapter 5. John chapter 5. Sometimes our excuse about how we live and the decisions we make comes down to this. Well, I was just born this way. This is the culture around me. This is what my family does and all those sort of things. And I just can't help it. I just can't help it, as if that is some sort of excuse. We'll say, well, I'm just human. I'm just human. And so being human, does that mean you don't have a choice? In John chapter 5, when you look in John chapter 5, we can't fall into this trap or the others that we're looking at this morning. We can't just say, I'm going to just float down the river. I'm going to be who I am. I'm going to live how I want to live. I know I got a problem with my temper, but that's just the way that I am. In John chapter 5, verse 39, it says, you search the Scriptures because you think in them that you have eternal life. It is these who testify about me, and you're unwilling to come to me so that you may have life. What's their problem? Was it an inability to come to Jesus? Inability to understand? He says, you're unwilling to come to me. They didn't want it. The idea here is that their pride, and maybe it was peer pressure, maybe it was finances, whatever it might be, they were unwilling. That's the problem. Just turn forward a few chapters to chapter 8 and verse 44. We looked at this in Bible class a couple weeks ago in detail, but in John 8 and verse 44, Jesus says, you are of your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. The fact of the matter is, they want to do it. I choose how I'm going to live. I can choose whether or not I'm going to steal. I can choose whether or not I'm going to lie. I can choose whether or not I'm going to murder. All those sort of things. And he says, when you do so, you are choosing to be like your father, the devil. And so it's quite a contrast from what we're looking at here in this text in Ephesians chapter 5. Got a couple more for you just in contrast that we'll cover real quickly. You know this verse in Acts chapter 26 and verse 9. You know this verse in Acts chapter 26 and verse 9. You may not remember. You know what it says. You may say, I don't know. But as soon as you get there, you're going to go, yeah, I know the one that you're talking about there. When you look at Paul and what he says in his defense there, he says, I thought to myself I had to do many things hostile to the name of Jesus Christ. We get in a rut and we say, I've always done this and I've always done that. I can't change. I've been a Christian for 15 years. I've been a Christian for 25, 30 years, whatever it might be. And we just kind of think, well, I'll just settle right in and I'll be comfortable doing what I do. But don't take any care about how I walk, how I live, or anything of that nature. And yet he was willing to change. He was convinced in his own heart, I need to persecute Christians. And yet he determined he needed to change. This concept here that, well, I'm doing what I've always done. I don't know how old Paul was when he became a Christian. Probably in his 30s, somewhere in that neighborhood. Here's a guy 30 years devoted to a way of life, devoted to living this way. What if he'd said, well, I'm just not going to change. I've seen the risen Lord, and I need to make some changes, but I'm not. What impact would that have had? I think about the Corinthian letters. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 7, just real fast. In 2 Corinthians chapter 7, he wrote to the Corinthians, the first letter, some pretty harsh and some kind of mentalities here that they needed to change. Blunt, to the point, got to make some changes. And when you get to the second letter, in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, after mentioning all that they needed to change, in verse 10 he says, the sorrow that is according to the will of God produces a repentance without regret, leading to salvation, but the sorrow of the world produces death. For behold, what earnestness this very thing, this godly sorrow has produced in you. What vindication of yourself, what indignation, what fear, what longing, what zeal, what avenging of wrong, and everything you demonstrated yourselves to be innocent of the matter. That is, they changed. They changed course. This excuse that, well, I've always done this. I've always lived this way. That's just the way that I am. Just doesn't carry water. He told them they needed to change, and then they changed. He needed to change, and then he changed. When we come to an understanding, I have to make some changes in my life, then I have to actually follow through with them. It's no excuse to say, but I've always done it this way. Or it's no excuse to use this one from 1 Corinthians chapter 5. My church says it's okay. Go look at it in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 1. I'm not going to read it, but here's a guy living with his father's wife. And that sentence means exactly what you think it means. It's exactly what was going on, but the people there in the church said, well, okay. He accuses them and convicts them of being arrogant and puffed up about it. That is, you sit there in the church in Corinth, and you've got that guy living in that situation in that local church there, and instead of doing something about it, they say, I'm not living with my father's wife. I'm not involved in that sin. He said, you're participating by not doing something about it. You get rid of it. Get rid of the sin. But sometimes that's the excuse. Well, I've always done it this way, and the church says it's okay. They don't have a problem with it, so it must be right. That's not walking as wise men, making the most of our time, trying to understand what the will of the Lord is. That's instead wanting to do what I want to do. One more, Romans chapter 1, please. Romans chapter 1. This may be the one that is the issue of all. The one that just simply says, you know what, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. How am I going to know what truth is? How am I going to understand the will of the Lord is? Well, need to understand what the will of the Lord is. First step in that is I got to know who the Lord is. Pharaoh used that in Exodus. Who's the Lord that I could go worship him? The fact of the matter is the Roman letter covers this same attitude in verse 28. It says, just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not profitable, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, envy, and he goes on and on. Is that the world that we live in? People lie and cheat, live together, swap partners, all kinds of things. Why? Well, the answer is in verse 28. Didn't see fit to acknowledge God any longer. Don't want to think about God. Don't talk about God. Don't want to have any moral standard of a creator. And in verse 32, although they knew the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but they also give hearty approval to those who practice them. Doesn't sound like a good deal, does it, in the end? We talk about getting approval sometimes. And we don't want to be the odd duck, but we look to others to get approval for the way we live. And we can find somebody that tells us, oh, it's okay, it doesn't matter. Live however you want to live. Why should I be concerned? Why should I worry about reading this book? Why should I worry about following through and trying to figure out what the will of the Lord is? Yeah, there's God and there's the Bible, but who cares? It doesn't really matter in the end. What would you say to that? Someone said it doesn't really matter. Well, you might stand up and say it absolutely does matter. How I live my life and how I spend my time and how I focus on understanding what the will of the Lord is. But the fact is, do we just say that? Should we give it lip service? Do we actually follow through with the change that's needed? Let's end our lesson back over in Ephesians chapter 5, if you will. Back where we started in Ephesians chapter 5. Let's read this text one more time, please. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 15. Let's expand it just for a couple minutes. In verse 15, the first word is therefore. It's a concluding word. So it's based on what is said before then. The idea you don't live in darkness anymore. You're light. You see that back up in verse 8. In other words, there's a code of conduct. So be careful how you walk. Not as unwise men. Now, if I just stopped and I put a period here, I'm not trying to change it, but if I just said, be careful how you walk, period, took the rest of it out, would that verse have any meaning to you? Would it have the teeth in it, we might say, to really make an impact? Be careful how you walk. Well, yeah, that would mean something. It would mean I needed to be careful about how I live, or I may need to be careful about some of the choices that I make. But he goes on to expand it just a little bit, making the most of your time. And then he says at the end of verse 16, a phrase that we haven't spent much time on this morning, because the days are evil. Now, what does he mean when he says, because the days are evil? Well, if I understand what he's talking about, day is put for their society and the way that people lived during that day, the world in which they lived. Just turn back a page real quick to chapter 4 and verse 19. Chapter 4 and verse 19. He says, and they, having become callous, the idea of callous is their hearts have been hardened, have given themselves over to sensuality, for the practice of every kind of impurity and greediness. Sensuality. Do we have any sensuality in the world in which we live in? Is there any sensuality in society or culture or anything like that? I'm not trying to be overly judgmental here, but I don't know how some Christians watch TV or go to the movies or watch a sporting event. Seems like the focus is upon sensuality. It hits us in every direction if you can. He says, for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. Practice of every kind of impurity. You just look east to west, far as you can, any direction, and try to encompass it all. Guess what? They had it in Ephesus with greediness. They were devoted to it. Verse 25, he says, therefore, laying aside falsehood. So he starts talking about things you got to do. He says not to sin in verse 26. Don't let the sun go down on your wrath. Don't steal any longer, verse 28. Put away in verse 31. In other words, these are how you used to live, but you no longer live this way. That's how society lives, but you are to be different. You are to live differently. You can't say whatever you want to about someone. You can't act however you want to act. You can't let the sun go down on your anger, verse 26. You can't say, well, I'll just get mad and I'll say, I'll never forgive you. You cannot do that. You cannot say that I'm unwilling to submit myself to the Lord. Don't steal, verse 28. You may say, I would never steal. You steal time from your employer? Well, the world thinks nothing of that. It used to be the joke about government jobs. It's not much of a joke right now. Verse 29, let no unwholesome word come from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification according to the need of the moment, so that it will give grace to those who hear. You try to speak to build people up, or do you try to speak to tear them down? All bitterness and wrath, verse 31, and anger and clamor, slander be put away from you, along with all malice. I know that's the way the world lives. And it may be the way that we used to live. But we cannot live that way any longer. In chapter 5 and in verse 3, he says, immorality, impurity, greed must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints. No filthiness and silly talk, coarse jesting, they're not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. You talk about moral conduct and moral speech. Why? Because the days are evil. We may say, well, it's hard to live that way. You know, I go to work and everybody else there talks a certain way. Everyone else acts a certain way. The people there cheat on their wives and all that sort of stuff. Guess what? That's the world in which the Ephesians lived in. I don't know if our society is as bad as it was in Ephesus and Corinth. but it's all around us. That is no excuse to not determine to live how the text says. Don't let the conduct of others, don't let the people of the congregation dictate. Don't be comfortable with just floating around and just living life wherever you are, however you want to today. Rather, he says in verse 15, be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time because the days are evil. So then do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Give your attention and effort to understanding what the will of the Lord is. Let's bring our lesson to a close. This starts with a decision that I have to make, a wise decision to make, where I recognize my guilt. I recognize that I need Christ and His sacrifice. I come to believe and understand that He is the resurrected Son of God. I'm willing to confess His name, be penitent, and baptized into Christ with a sincere decision to turn and to live my life in service to Him. Where are you at? Where are you at in that service? Where are you at in doing what the Savior and King would have you to do? We can assist you with it, and where you're at in a public manner this morning, let us know as we stand together as we sing.